There we go. All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kim Poe. I'm the Children and Young Adult Consultant with the Connecticut State Library, here with my colleague, Brad.
Right, and I'm Brad Bullis from the Connecticut State Library. I'm the Digital Content and Innovation Coordinator. And when both Kim and I have done some weeding together. And just a little background about what I have done in terms of weeding, I'll share, and Kim will do the same. But uh, when I was working in a public library, I was a selector for the 900s and the 300s and some other areas here and there. But I was responsible for selecting in that area and also weeding and shelf reading in that area. And then we've done some weeding at the Middletown Library Service Center. We've done the professional development collection. We've done some large print work. Kim and I have worked extensively on trying to find ways to dispose of those items that we weed in great ways that allow them to have a second life. That's one of the goals that we have. But I'll pass it back to you, Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. Yes, Brad and I have been in the trenches with the Middletown Library Service Center and our old building in Rocky Hill, just going through like 30,000 titles of large print. But prior to my time here at the Middletown Library Service Center with the Connecticut State Library, I've worked in libraries of all sizes, large multi-branch systems, small rural libraries, even a bookmobile, and have done weeding and acquisitions in all of those spaces. My primary focus has always been children and young adult titles. But then moving into the service center, was able to sort of broaden my knowledge base in particularly the professional collection, which includes the entire collection management process, as we said, from acquisitions to weeding or deselection.
So the agenda today, as you can see, we've done our introductions. As Kim said, use the chat for any issues that you'd like to have addressed. We're going to talk about weeding in the Garden of Good and Evil today. So that's the exciting title for an exciting presentation. And at the end, Kim has a wonderful weeding video that utilizes our weeding slip. So it's super helpful. So that's sort of the agenda for the day. Again, feel free to put questions into the chat as they come up. So the first little thing we want to talk about is, when you think about weeding your collection, you want to view it through a lens of resource sharing, because that can really help you make decisions about what you can weed and, if you should weed something. So the first link there is to the DLD website. So that's just all sorts of great information there. But when you look at the resources that DLD provides, it starts with the Middletown Library Service Center. So that is a library for librarians. We have all sorts of resources there that you can take advantage of. You borrow the items, you bring them into your collection for a while, and you can share them with your patrons. So we have books, large print, professional collection, as Kim mentioned. So that's a great resource for your staff's professional development. But we have large print as well, a great large print collection, which really kind of falls under the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books, because that's one of those formats that actually really works well in that venue. But we also have a bunch of children and YA titles that Kim selects. They wind up being selected also often for the Ego CT program. But we do have a great collection of, say, like you're going to do a big read type of thing with all CT reads. We have multiple copies. And again, we also add those to the Ego CT program. So there are puppets that can be borrowed. There are other equipment type items. So go to the Middletown Library Service Center, take a look at everything, and you can see what you can get. There's actually a way to book everything. So there's a great number of resources at the Middletown Library Service Center. There's a lot going on under our roof. And so in addition to sort of just the collections that are there, we have a bunch of the its, as I would call them. So I'm going to start with Deliver It, and these all kind of connect, which is pretty interesting and helpful that we have that sort of that life cycle of resource sharing that all kind of emanates from the Middletown Library Service Center and the work that DLD does. So Deliver It is the first program I want to talk about, and that is a delivery system between libraries here in Connecticut. So when materials are borrowed through Borrow It or through the Interlibrary Loan Program, they can be sent from one library to another and returned that way through the deliberate system. So that's one foundational piece of a resource sharing service that we have at the Middletown Library Service Center. This is a little bit out of order, but it does factor into resource sharing and to decision making when you're weeding. Research It is a suite of 38 databases that we provide to the K through 12s, the public libraries, and the academics. So there is a lot of very current information that can act or supplement your reference collection. So when you're making decisions about your reference collection, and you know, other magazines and that type of thing within your collection, you should think about what's available in Research It, and that will help you sometimes make a good decision about removing something from your collection. Another program that we have is the EgoCT program, which utilizes the Palace Project. EgoCT is the state program. The Palace Project is the app that we utilize to access ebooks. So we have over 33,000 items that are available in the EgoCT program for free to public libraries. And now we have 18 academics as well. For the K through 12s, we have the EgoCT Community Sharing Program, which works with schools that have a Destiny catalog. We're able to send our Baker and Taylor ebook content right into their catalog. So again, resource sharing and weeding go hand in hand, because if you look at other ways that someone might be able to put their hands on a title that you're thinking about weeding, the ebook program is another place to look and to consider as you're making your decisions. So the other thing we have is Find It. And Find It and Request It are kind of put together because they work hand in glove. Find It is the state union catalog. So we have over 300 libraries that submit their holdings into Find It. But Request It is the interlibrary loan platform, which utilizes fulfillment, which allows you to request those items from other libraries. So again, you know, and when you utilize Request It, you're going to be utilizing the Deliver It system. So you can see how these different services overlap and create a whole when it comes to resource sharing for the state library. The other program that we have is Borrow It. And Borrow is pretty unique across the country in terms of what we are able to do. And it's really based on the generosity of all the public libraries here in Connecticut, that you can take your public library card. So for me, it's EC Scranton Memorial Library. So I have my card. I can go to any other public library in the state, get my card registered, and I can check materials out. So that is a great program that we have here in Connecticut. Once you have read the book and you're done with it, you can bring it to your local library, pass it along to them, and they will send it back to the library that you borrowed it from via Deliver It. So again, you kind of have that whole, you know, full circle of resource sharing that is, you know, found with the services that we provide. And then also under our roof, we also have the Connecticut Library for Accessible Books, which is CT Lab. And that is a network library of the Library of Congress, their national library service for the blind and print disabled. CT Lab lends books and magazines in audio and braille formats for free to any Connecticut citizen who is unable to read regular print due to visual reading or a physical disability. So another great resource that is under the roof of the Middletown Library Service Center.
Thanks, Brad. So now let's get a little bit into this whole weeding thing. Brad's done a really great job of bringing to light some resource sharing resources, which can affect sort of what we choose to bring into our building, but let's kind of get into the nitty gritty of this. So ultimately what it is that we're looking for when we're talking about weeding our collection is sort of a less is more concept. And as you sort of see here in the images, a this, not that. So under our this image, the books are neat, they're organized. I think the word to describe this is the titles under this image are discoverable. You can find them, you can access them, you can use them. When we have sort of the chaos under the not this image, those titles aren't discoverable. There's nothing visually appealing about them. Quite frankly, there might be people who don't even want to go to that section of a library to even attempt to look for anything, because I know for me, a situation like that would be incredibly overwhelming. So it's really not the quantity of titles that we have within our collection that makes our collection great. It is the quality of the titles that we have, and if they are discoverable and accessible for our library patrons. So when we talk about weeding, although you all are about to sort of sit here with us and go through a weeding presentation, there's no one way. We'll give you ways, right? We'll sort of share resources that have been made available through a variety of libraries, and sort of, the expertise of me, Brad, and the people who came before us and put together this original presentation. But there's no one way to do any of this. And at the end of the day, we all, including Brad and myself at the Service Center, we all have to sit down and think about our who it is that we're serving. So in addition to that, it's really important to have a well thought out collection development policy that includes weeding. And I think what we should probably really migrate to saying is a collection management policy, because that incorporates how we handle our collection from the moment we sit down in Baker and Taylor, Ingram, whoever, to select a title, to the moment that we weed that title and it leaves our building and goes somewhere else. It's also really important to be well informed about not only your community, but a wide variety of literature, which can feel, I think, a little overwhelming to some folks because we can't read all the books and maybe we're not interested in sort of reading all the things. And to that end, our colleague Gail Hurley is actually doing a 4-part workshop series right now with Becky Spratford on Reader's Advisory, which is really worth considering. Because again, it's a part of the collection management process that's going to tie directly into the weeding process. And it's important to be familiar with books, authors, and library materials that you have within your facility, but also, as we talked about, other accessible resources and ways to access them in Connecticut. We're really lucky to be kind of tiny and have a lot of the resources that we have for shareability that you might not find in some larger and other states. So just some things to keep in mind. We're going to give you a way, but there is no way at the end of the day. A lot of moving pieces happen at the same time. So in addition to that, it's really helpful to be familiar with your library's long-range plan, 5-year plan, strategic plan, whatever it is that you call it, and the goals within that plan. If, for example, your 5-year plan mentions that you want to provide more resources, services, and just pay more attention to your multilingual community, for example, that's going to affect the way you manage your collection, what you bring in and what needs to go out, so you can bring in new resources if that's necessary. Or if your community is aging and you want to provide more services, resources, and pay more attention to your aging community, that's going to affect what happens with your collection. And it may affect what happens to your collection first, or sort of early on in that 5-year plan process. And again, sort of as we mentioned, it's really important to know the needs of your community. And I think it's really important to do the mental work to separate the needs of your community and the needs of us, right? So sort of what I like and what I prioritize as a library user and a reader may be different from the community that I'm serving. So it's really important to do the work that we need to do to keep our community at the forefront of our minds, and take all of these things into account when we are weeding our collection.
All right. So, as Kim was saying, you need to sort of have a thought process about why you're weeding. So, why do you weed? I mean, obviously, weeding, as the slide says, is an integral part of collection management. You have to look at what you're purchasing and with what needs to be discarded, and you have to make a balanced decision about that. It is critically important that not just you, but your colleagues and the staff as a whole are basically able to communicate why you're weeding, because sometimes you may be challenged about why you're reading these books, and to have basically a policy that you can refer back to, an understanding, of the staff that may be interacting with patrons as they're going through the weeding process. Make sure they understand why, and share this information too with your friends group, with your board, your any of your stakeholders, so that they understand why you're reading the collection. Because ultimately, it's what we do as librarians is try to provide the best collection you can, provide to your community. So it's good to have a talk track that kind of aligns with that. There are, benefits that we're going to talk about with weeding. One of them, it helps identify gaps in the collection. So when you're out there weeding, shelf reading, doing collection maintenance as part of your collection management program, you're able to identify gaps in the collection. There's nothing better than actually being in the collection. Every time that I went into either shelf read or weed our collection, I found out something new about the collection that I really didn't know. So it helps really provide you with a good understanding of your collection, and it helps you build it in a better way. So the fact that you have items on the shelves that are no longer useful, no longer accurate, no longer relevant to the community you serve, is an important distinction. So you want to make sure that those are removed from the collection, and then you go ahead and you're able to fill the gaps that are created as part of your collection management process. Next slide. So, as I said, weeding is not irresponsible. You are not just throwing things away that have this amazing value. A book's life cycle, from the time you purchase it to the time you might get rid of it because it's no longer circulating, or it's no longer in good shape, it's no longer relevant, it's part of the process of building a great collection for your community. So, again, when you consider why you weed, make sure everybody understands it, and make sure you can articulate why you're doing what you're doing. And a policy that is something that can be shown to any stakeholder that you can always refer them to is critical to have. Policies basically, help vaccinate you against challenges. So, benefits of weeding. So there are great benefits of weeding, as I talked about earlier. It can save space. When you go through and look at a collection, I think the second or third slide that Kim had, it was a collection that, like, it looks good like this. It doesn't look good like this. So if books are, on the floor, willy-nilly on the shelves, it doesn't look good for the public as they come in to interact with the collection. So you really want to make sure that your shelves are organized, they're shelf read, they're clean and efficient looking, and they make it easy for everybody to get in there and access what they want. The other thing with saving space is you may be utilizing your library in more of a community center role. And so if you're doing that, you may need to remove some books that are no longer really serving the community properly to create spaces for, as at the library I worked at, we had to create a space for a cafe, a makerspace area, and a co-working area. And those were really important services in addition to the collection that we wanted to expand upon. So sometimes you have to remove items to create space. So you need to do that in a way that your policy supports and that you can do correctly. It saves time. When you weed, your collection is going to be much more, nice to look at. It's going to be easier for the patron to go and find the call number and then go find the item on the shelf where it's supposed to be. It saves time for shelvers when they're doing their work. If it's, in order and they can just find exactly where they have to go. And then when they're shelving, they don't have to shift the collection at the same time, which does happen at some libraries, which is a big challenge. And it saves time for the staff when they're interacting with a patron and they bring the patron to a spot in the collection where they've identified some books that might be relevant. You want to bring them to something that looks good and is appealing. So again, next bullet is make the collection more appealing. It does make it more appealing if it's neat and orderly. And also if you can have some outward facing titles, so it's a little bit more like a bookstore. So the browsing that patrons might do is much more enjoyable for them. So you want to make it a good customer experience, and weeding allows for that to happen. And finally, it's a well-known fact that when you weed, your collection is much more discoverable and therefore increases circulation. So the direct benefit is it's almost counterintuitive. You think, oh, I'm weeding, I'm removing items that could go out. Well, you know what? They were items that really were no longer going out and providing value to your community anyway. So it does tend to have that benefit of increased circulation. So again, more benefits of weeding. You want to be in your community, the place that people go to get good, accurate, current information. If information that we provide is outdated or not factual, that hurts our reputation and credibility as a library. So you want to make sure that your collection is something you can be proud of, and that when you do share information with patrons, you know that it's high quality information. The process of weeding, like I was saying earlier, and this happens with shelf reading as well, is it helps you really keep up with what's in the collection. Again, every time I went into the stacks and weeded or shelf read, I learned something about the collection. So it helps you go back and then select items that really serve your community through your collection purchasing process. So there's, again, another great benefit is your collection gets better and better as you go through the weeding process. And the follow up to this is you're getting constant insight on the collection strengths and weaknesses, because when you do go in and start shelf reading or weeding, you're looking at your collection in such a way that you definitely will see, hey, we're really weak in this area. And it may be a topic that, in 3 to 5 years ago wasn't as important as it is now. As we know, things have changed so much in the last few years with COVID, and the political climate has changed. So your collection needs have evolved very much to the way things were prior to COVID. So anyway, those are a lot of the great benefits of reading.
Thanks, Brad. So let's talk a little bit about your policy and sort of what your policy should look like. And I'm going to preemptively say that within these slides, which are available on the Weeding Workshop LibGuides page, we have direct links to policies as examples. So we're not kind of leaving you in the dark to work with not a whole lot of information. So your weeding policy should absolutely be a part of your material selection policy, because when we're talking about weeding, we're talking about kind of the deselection process. It's all the same wheel. You can't have one without the other. There will come a point where you cannot add materials to your collection without removing some of what is there for a lot of the reasons that Brad was talking about. So weeding needs to be a part of your material selection policy or your collection management policy, because you can't have one without the other. Within your policy, you should make sure to include the reasons for weeding, sort of, and what is involved within your weeding process. And some of the things that those are going to include is the criteria that you use for weeding. We're going to go over criteria today. It's the criteria that we use at the Middletown Library Service Center from the crew manual, which we'll dive into later. And you also want to have some information on your disposal method for your weeded titles. Understandably, your residents are going to want to know, why are you weeding these books? What makes you decide what to weed and what not to weed? What are you doing with these books? Our tax dollars paid for these books. Words, 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 right? And while we know what we're doing because we've been educated on it either in school or through professional development opportunities like this one, the general public doesn't know anything about that. They don't know. So having some information in place already, so that if someone does come to you and they're very concerned about what you're doing and why you're doing it, you're already set up to answer your questions. I know I do the best I can when sort of building information to answer the questions that I anticipate being asked before we even get there, right? To sort of make things easier for everyone at the end of the day. So some of the examples that we have of weeding policies are ours. That's just because we just recently redid ours and we're really proud of it. And our weeding section is actually really simple. It doesn't have to be incredibly complicated. Because we want it to be easy for us to learn, know about, and for anyone else, right, to sort of understand. We're not trying to make this complicated. And we've got a couple of other examples of some weeding policies that you can sort of model, in libraries. Sharing is caring. So let's dive into some of that criteria that we were talking about, right? So what is our criteria for weeding? And it's kind of broken down into three sections: content, format, and use. When we say use, we're talking about circulation. So let's dive into some of this. Um, we want to weed items that are out of date, misleading, or factually inaccurate. The information that sort of existed might have been accurate when we got the book, but now it's not. And, as a trusted informational resource within communities, we have to have it together. So for example, this is an example I use every time because it hit close to my heart. But when we demoted Pluto from planet status, it was really rough for me. Pluto was very much an important planet to me because I was convinced you could ice skate on it. I don't know. As a child, you couldn't tell me that wasn't a thing that you could do. So it's really important that we have accurate information on that. We know that almost every kid at some point in like the third grade is going to have to do some report or maybe a project or whatever on the solar system. And if they come to our library and utilize our resources for that school project and our information is wrong, these residents have no reason to question the information that they get from the service center. Well, I mean, there too. From the library. They have no reason to question that information. And while, yes, you hope that, parents or caregivers, older siblings, whatever, can kind of step in and correct some of that information, it's our job to make sure that the information that we're handing off to our patrons is accurate and no one's going to side eye us. Or another thing that I kind of like, a hill that I will climb up for my whole life: George Washington Carver, peanut butter, we got to stop. I, in fact, was sent a finished book from a publisher that stated in that title that George Washington Carver created peanut butter, and I couldn't put it on the shelves because I knew it was wrong because I did a report on George Washington Carver in the third grade, and I wore my mom's white robe and pretended it was a lab coat. We've got to put out that accurate information. Otherwise, what are we even doing? Also, with regards to content, is the information superseded by a new edition or a better subject? And sometimes you'll see in some of those like world book kind of like sets or whatever, when that information is updated, it's really important that we remove any old editions that we might have of that information because things might have changed, especially when we're talking about other countries, things like populations. And as things are changing a lot with our environment, right? Like a lot is changing, I think, quicker than we might realize because we're living through it. So any of that older edition information, especially if you have updated editions, it's got to go. And as well as outdated bestsellers. So there might have been some titles like Twilight, for example, right? Once upon a time when I was working in libraries, we needed like 6 copies of that book on hand at all times because of the sheer quantity of people that were reading the books at the same time. It wasn't enough to have 1 copy because then we'd have the world's longest wait list. And because everyone in this state was reading the book, and by state I mean country, our resource sharing services just couldn't keep up. So it was really important that we had like 6 copies of Twilight at one time. That's not so important anymore. I mean, at least not in the town that I worked in and still live in. Maybe that's not true for you and your town and your community. And that's why we say there's no one way to do this, because what's true where I am might not be true where you are. So you have to kind of go through and look at all this information as a whole and not miss the forest for the trees. You also want to be really cognizant of format. Books that have like rips or missing pages, things that have been binded, bound, binded, binded, too much. Like there's just too much tape involved in this situation. It's time to get something new. If sort of the print or paper or even the binding might be of poor quality. I know we see some of that, particularly in youth services and maybe adult services too. Some graphic novel books, it's just like, it's going to fall apart after 3 uses. it's just sort of the glue, whatever it is they're kind of doing there. And also books that have been edited, be that pages crossed out or words crossed out, just kind of all of that stuff. Those things have to go. That is not sort of our collection speaks to us as libraries, sort of, right, and sort of how we operate and what we prioritize. And that's not the stuff that we want to be putting into the forefront of our communities. I know we had a children's book series at the library I worked at by Karma Wilson, if anyone knows his Karma Wilson books. And every single page of the book had tape. Every single page of that book had been taped back in. And eventually we were like, let's just buy another one, right? Like there is such a thing as like, it's just too far gone and it's just time to replace. And it's really important. We want to put our best foot forward with these titles that we're giving to other people. And then use, right, which is basically like circulation. So it's really important to be cognizant of publication dates, not just the date you got the book, but the date that the book was published, because approximately 50% of circulation of a title is going to occur within the first 5 years of acquisition. That's the time when a book is the most popular. And quite frankly, in reality, it's probably even less than that, especially if we're talking about someone who churns out books like they have no other hobbies. People are going to read the books that came out and then they're moving on. They're looking forward. They're not necessarily looking backward. And again, that's not true for all people in all communities. I'm a big rereader, which is why you can't miss the forest for the trees with this. You've got to look at sort of everything that we're saying and everything that we're presenting. Check the last circulation date of some of your titles when you're going through the weeding process, and consider weeding items that haven't circulated within like a 3 to 5 year range. And when we dive forward into the crew manual, which is literally the next slide, there's really great formulas to help you out with some of this, because some of these numbers are a bit nuanced, particularly when you get into nonfiction, and that's for both adult titles and children's titles. So I've mentioned the crew manual a couple times. What is that? What does it stand for? CREW stands for Continuous Review, Evaluation, Weeding. That is what we are doing to our collection. We are continuously reviewing. Unfortunately, there is no end to weeding. It just goes and goes. Brad and I started at the service center, I think 2 months apart, and I have been weeding for 4.5 years nonstop, just hopping from part of the collection to part of the collection, as Brad does the really great work of like pulling this stuff from the systems. It just doesn't end. You just sort of move, you just move to a new spot. So within the crew manual, they give us a really awesome acronym to help us remember some of those titles that we're going to want to prioritize removing from our collection. And that acronym is MUSTY. Kind of weird, but once you know it, you don't forget it. So MUSTY stands for, again, as we mentioned, titles that are misleading or inaccurate, titles that are ugly or worn beyond mending. Once you put tape on every page of the Karma Wilson books, like what else, what's left, right? It's time for it to go. As we've mentioned, titles that are superseded by newer or better works, especially with some of those nonfiction like sets. If you purchase the new set, get rid of the old one. It's only going to cause confusion. But also titles that are trivial or of no literary or scientific method. There are things that even within my not super long life, although it feels very long, that at one point we really, really cared about. If you still have books in your collection talking about the panic of Y2K, not the panic that we thought was going to happen and then it didn't, and it's kind of funny when you look back on it, but if the books are written as if like you still need to be on edge, the ATMs aren't going to work. If you've still got those talking as if Y2K didn't happen, you're really going to need to let those go. Right? It's perspective and priority. At one point, we really cared. I was there. And now we're kind of evaluating that situation through a different lens. Any titles that are irrelevant to the needs or interests of your community. There are going to be certain titles and certain subjects that are going to have a higher, I imagine, are going to have a higher priority, say, in rural communities. There are going to be certain titles, like, say, urban planning titles that are going to have a different type of significance in, places like Bridgeport, New Haven, even like New London, right? That you might not need as robust a collection in other communities. So things that are irrelevant, and also things that you can find elsewhere, which is sort of how we started this, right? We started right from the gate telling you about a myriad of other resources that made it relatively easy. We all have to have a little bit of patience, but relatively easy to access other titles from, all the libraries in the state. There are more public libraries in towns in this state. Like, if you can get it from somewhere else, or like 10 somewhere else's, right? Maybe it's not super important to have in your library. So this is sort of a quote that was thrown in, well, not thrown in, it was strategically placed into this presentation. Really, I think just to sort of pull us back. We are librarians, we are library people, we are book lovers too. But sometimes it's worth keeping into perspective that, like, they're just books, man. They're just books. Not to mention, uh, part of the quote says, there's no point in stockpiling stories that no longer speak to anyone. Scientific knowledge decades out of date, speculation about the future that never came to pass. Y2K, information shaped by racism and the sexism of its time. And at the end of the day, they are just books. They can outlive their usefulness. We as a people can outgrow the need that may have existed at one point by these titles. And, like, as hard as it is for some folks, you just got to do it. It's going to be fine. The world's not going to end. Necessary. Now, as I mentioned at the very beginning, there's no formula for weeding. There's kind of a formula for weeding. And this is it. So within the crew manual, and if anyone went to our LibGuide and clicked on the crew manual link, which is there, if anyone had like printed it or something, if this is like, the second or so time you're going through this and you just so happen to have that manual, this is from page 105. Or if you're watching the recording, 105. That portion of the crew manual breaks out a bunch of these formulas for us. And the formulas are broken down by age, circ, and musty. So what you're going to see, for example, if you're looking in the 610 section, which is medicine, you're going to see 5, 3, and musty. That's what you're going to see in the crew manual. And what that's telling you is that if the book is more than 5 years old, so that first section is age, if it has not circulated more than 3 times, so that's that middle number, that's circ, and if it falls into the acronym of musty, right? It's just ugly and messed up. It's, we've learned so much about diseases in the last 3 years, right? If it's sort of superseded by new information, knock it out, get rid of it. 5, 3, musty. It's got to go. Time for it to go. But then what you'll notice is that another section of our nonfiction collection, and this is nonfiction, adult, children. I know that a lot of colleges might not use Library of Congress subject headings, but this is all kind of the same information, right? Computers are going to be different, right? So you see the age number for computers is 3, and that's because technology changes at light speed. Technology changes and we learn at a different rate than we might learn, and there might be change in other fields, such as medicine, where you have to like test stuff on people, right? So you're going to see that the age of the book for the computer section, the 004, is going to be 3 years, as opposed to medicine, which is 5 years. But now you see a little bit something different in this formula. You'll see an X by circ. And what that means is, like, no one cares. If it's gone out 57 times, but it's 7 years old, ignore that 57 number and get it out of here because it's probably super out of date. So when you see an X somewhere within the formulas that the crew method gets you, what it's saying is we're not even paying attention to that. We're really not. Someone might have checked out like a Windows 97 for Dummies book. Please just get rid of it. I don't even think you can have an operating system that old anymore. So that is sort of what these formulas are. And really what they are is they are guidelines more than rules, right? There's something to help you get started and there's something to point you in a direction. It's not the end all be all of information. There is nuance. We've talked about things like what's important to your community and things like that. But as we sort of mentioned, right, things on a fast changing field, such as infectious diseases. We all know what that is. Artificial intelligence. We extra all know what that is. Green technologies, right? Like from yesterday to today, all of this stuff, right? The change is so quick and rapid. The formula, the crew manual is going to get you is going to be 2 years. No one cares about the circs and musty, right? If it's damaged, edited, all of that stuff. So this is what the crew manual does. This is sort of what it looks like. And they've done these formulas for almost every major Dewey field within a library. And again, I do recognize that some libraries, I worked in an academic library myself for 4 years, might use Library of Congress subject headings. So then you just kind of have to like look at the number that they're giving you for Dewey and sort of accredit that to as close as you can within your own library's system. And but the formulas and sort of the information that they're giving you is going to stay the same. And so here is the direct link. So anytime you see anything that looks like a hyperlink, blue with sort of the underline in these slides, it is a live link that Brad and I recently checked. So everything in here should be alive and well, unless something has happened in the last like 4 days. So this slide is going to give you a direct link to the crew manual that we've been talking about. But again, it is also available as a link on the Weeding Workshop LibGuides page. And so we've talked about how it breaks things down into, and so this is the new crew manual. There is an old crew manual. I put new in, quotes, because it was 2012. So I don't know, I guess in the history of how long books have existed, that's new. Yes, and so the changes that have been made to the new crew manual is that they now include the subject areas. There's also, if you look through the entire manual itself and you don't just go to that page with the formulas, it does give you a bit of nuance and a bit of information to keep an eye out for within the sections with regards to the text, because like we said, there is a formula, but there's not a formula, and it is a rule, but it's not a rule. So it's time consuming, but it is, like I said, I have been weeding for 4.5 years. I'm not done. It is time consuming, but it's really important to sort of, again, don't miss that forest because you're looking at that tree. So, and this crew manual was developed in Texas. So there might be some Texas specific information kind of smattered throughout, but at the end of the day, like it really is a great resource. Still, it's held up pretty well with a lot of great resources within the bibliography as well. And the crew method or the crew manual also provides a couple of like special sections. So there is a reference section there because a lot of things are happening with reference collections. And we're going to dive into a few of these special areas later. Non-print, as Brad mentioned, like the service center has like robots and puppets and stuff. Those things have to be evaluated and possibly weeded as well. And children's things can get a little bit wonky kind of depending on the section, but we'll go into that stuff a little bit later. Now, what would I not weed? So things that are sort of local interest or are local to the history of your community. We live in Connecticut. Connecticut is old. People have been in this New England spot for longer than they've been anywhere else in this country. So it is possible that your library does have old newspapers, flyers, money, maybe, right? Things that perhaps your local historical society is housing in your libraries. I know there are some libraries where a piece of the library kind of does a tribute to something like that. Those are items that you might not just kind of want to like willy-nilly try to send to sustainable shelves or Better World Books. You might want to take a beat and consider really what it is that you want to do with those titles before just being like, well, musty 5-3. You know, you don't necessarily want to do that. Also, rare items within some of the resources that we have, we do have resources where you can kind of look and see if there's a book or something that might be worth something. And so it might be something that you just kind of, again, want to reconsider what it is you do with it before you're sending it off to like, you know, some other organization. Materials that might be out of print or irreplaceable. So that might be, you're probably going to find some of those items more so in like an academic space than you might in a public library. And maybe you don't want to leave that title on the floor for just general circulation if it is something that is a little bit more treasured and it is something that you're not necessarily going to be able to get another copy of, but it feels worth keeping in your collection. So maybe it moves somewhere else. Maybe it moves to reference. Maybe it moves behind the desk or something and people can request it. But again, these are some of the spots where you don't just want to 5-3 musty. It's time for it to go. You just kind of want to take a beat. And again, something that you're going to see more likely in academic libraries or state libraries for that matter, materials of research value. Which might actually overlap with some of that historical information, perhaps like old laws, law rulings, uh, maps of buildings that are old. I don't know. I don't work in an academic library anymore. But again, these are just some examples of things. Don't just like take that crew formula and go ham. You might just want to take a beat.
All right, thanks, Kim. So one other thing we want to just mention, and this is a section that is in the crew manual. But ebooks are definitely something that you want to consider when you think about weeding. But the nice thing, and this is sort of something, if you think about the ebook legislation that you've seen lately, you understand that ebook licenses are not necessarily that good and they're not that fair. So many times we only have a license that is for 1 year or maybe 2 years. So what that really presents for a collection is that it self-weeds. You're basically provided with an opportunity when a book is going to expire, the license is going to expire. You are notified by the distributor and they let you know that this is occurring. And you can either decide at that point in time based on the circs or whatever criteria you want to utilize, whether you should purchase that item again or whether you should just let it go. And so this happens to me on a weekly basis. I get a report from my distributors at Baker and Taylor and the Palace Marketplace, and they let me know what's fading away, and I make a decision. Do I want to keep it again? Is it worth spending that money? And again, that's a budgetary decision too. So you really want to think about your dollars and how you spend them. And thankfully, you do have easy access to the circulation data, which is really going to be the driving force when it comes to ebooks. If it's something that's getting checked out all the time, like basically almost every time it can, say every 3 or 4 weeks over a 1 year period, you might want to buy it again. So yeah, we just wanted to share that piece with you. And again, it's in the crew manual. The crew manual is something that, it's not something you read from, front cover to back. It's something that you basically use as a tool. And so you can kind of pick and choose what you need to read based on what area of the collection you're focused on. All right. So now Kim has given us the criteria. We've talked about the crew manual. We've talked about musty. Now we're going to talk about actually going out into the stacks and getting it done. I am one of those strange people who actually did like weeding. And the reason why I did is because it really did connect me with the collection. So I found value in that, but a lot of people struggle with just it's a daunting task. So you really need to look at it as something that is not done one time. You need to schedule times for weeding. So at a library that I worked at, one of the things that we did is we would set a schedule, and it was a continuous process for weeding. So in the morning before the library opened up, I would be out there and try to do my weeding then. I also, strangely enough, did like to be in the stacks weeding when we were open to the public because I got to interact with folks, talk about the collection with them, get feedback about maybe what we have and what we need. So for me, that was good. But in terms of efficiency, sometimes the best time is either when the library is closed or when it's slow to get in there and do your work. And then you've done your work for that week and you move on. Um, when you're going to have a weeding project that is going to be accomplished, if at all possible, you want to shelf read prior to weeding. I have to say, sometimes I sort of shelf read and I weeded at the same time. But I was responsible for that collection. You may want to work with your circulation team to have a section shelf read prior to weeding. So, it's one of those things that just makes the process of weeding so much easier if everything is basically in order. And the next bullet is in conjunction with an inventory. Again, you want things to be in order because when you're doing an inventory, you're often either with a computer or with a paper list. You have everything and the order it's supposed to be in, and you're looking to make sure that the item is there as you conduct that inventory. And again, that's one of those things too, where when you're doing the inventory, if you're the selector of that area, you could do a little weeding as you make it go too. But again, I think sometimes you want to just make sure you don't make one project more difficult by kind of combining it into three projects. So if you focus simply on the weeding, it'll kind of make your life much easier and make the process of weeding more enjoyable. And that's why we want you to take it in small doses. This is a continuous process throughout the year. You always should be weeding. I tried to weed 2 to 3 days a week when I was at my previous library. It's one of those things where it does allow it to be something where you're always involved in the collection. It helped my collection development decisions. So it's one of those things that if you try to do it all at once, like, hey, the month of February, I'm going to just weed the whole collection. It's not going to happen. So it is one of those challenges you want to kind of factor in and make sure that you set up a nice schedule. And again, don't get overwhelmed by it because if you do, you'll probably just give up. The other thing that we did, as I mentioned earlier, is we had to create space. So if it's a renovation or some construction is coming up, that's a great time to kind of do like an all hands on deck type of staff weeding. Come up with very simple criteria. If it's your circulation collection, just say, everything that hasn't circulated in X amount of years, and you pick the year. It could be 3, it could be 5, but just go through the collection and do a sweep. That will work out well. Don't worry necessarily about the items like where you're going into the collection, you're doing that big sweep. Just set up a process afterward that a quick review can be done so that you're not getting rid of materials that you really should keep. So who's involved in the process, and who should really be knowledgeable about the process? So it's everyone that's on your staff. The friends, the board should understand the importance, as I've said earlier, and Kim has mentioned as well. Make sure you communicate the whole process, your procedures. Again, when you have procedures for something, and even like you can show the weeding list that I have here, little things like that you can show to um, your stakeholders that show you have a very well thought out process helps so much. When you're going through a weeding project, it helps so much if you can have someone working with you. It lightens the load. Many hands lighten the load, of course, right? But it also gives you someone to share feedback with, to get a second opinion about a title. It just makes it a much more pleasant experience and probably helps your accuracy and your decision making process when it comes to weeding certain items out of your collection. The other thing is there are experts. HealthNet is willing to Health net librarians are willing to help you with your medical or health section, and law librarians can help you with your legal, especially legal reference, which is where I found assistance when I was leading our reference collection at my previous library. And thankfully, right around the corner was the judicial courthouse and the library that's associated with it. And I brought those folks in, and they went through the legal reference collection with me, and that literally helped me pick almost everything that I weeded. And I was able to therefore make those decisions with great confidence. And it took a lot of worry out of the process, because when you're looking at, these resources sometimes cost a lot of money, or, these resources might be looked for by someone in the future. They would basically go through, let me know what was outdated, what could be removed without a problem. And then they provided alternative locations for that much information. So, be it it was something that could be found in a database, or they could actually go to the courthouse library and do research there. There are other options, and that's always a great help when you're trying to make a decision about removing something from your collection. Um, Another thing that you might want to consider is take it out of the reference collection and put it in the circulating collection. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but that is another way to make a decision that doesn't necessarily read the book, but it moves it along the process. And ultimately, the person who is responsible for collection development should be involved in this process, and they should really be making the final decision. Now, are they going to be able to make a decision on every title that you're reading? No, but hopefully they provided guidelines that you can utilize, because it can be any staff member that might be in there, especially if you're doing a big weed, pulling things off the shelf. But the guidelines that need to be developed so that people can do the job correctly should be available. And this sort of acts as well as the person who's in charge of collection development, to making sure that the collection development decision-making process is complete. So you really want to make sure that you do that. And when you talk about guidelines too, you want to make sure that there are guidelines for people who are shelving and are working in the stacks doing shelf reading. So make sure when you put people out there that they're trained, and that way they actually interact with the collection, keep it accurate, and make it appealing, as we talked about earlier. So when you're out there and you're actually in the stacks, you're going to need some supplies. As I mentioned earlier, having the circulation records that show last circulation, how many times it circled, the publication date, some of the things that Kim referred to earlier, having that information readily available is super helpful. You also want to have a place to work. So I always had a book truck, and I worked basically, the top was my desk, the bottom were the books that I removed. So, it basically was a moving desk, and I brought it with me throughout the collection. So get a book truck to help you with your work. Also have the crew manual. Like I said, the crew manual is not something you read from cover to cover. It's a tool that you use when you're going through the weeding process. So make sure you have the manual ready. It's so helpful sometimes to just, you have something going on in your mind. Maybe you don't remember exactly what the recommended formula is. So to have the manual right there to utilize as a tool and to sort of help buttress your decision that you might be making about a title is super helpful. You also are probably going to be making notes, so you want to make sure you have, scrap cards, a pen, a pencil, to make notes, because not only are you reading, but you're doing collection development and collection management. So you may be saying, "Hey, I'm removing these items. I either have to add in this title again." From, get the newer edition, get a nicer edition that's not damaged or highlighted on every page, or you may have to find similar items that cover that subject but are more up to date. And then we have weeding slips. So the nice thing about a weeding slip is it acts basically as a decision-making tool as you are looking at a particular item in the collection that you're considering removal of. And so to me, that's one of those things, again, that helps you justify your decision. And you can share that information if you're ever questioned on it. But it also allows you to have a bit of workflow as you're out there, because really having a very defined process and way you go about doing your weeding will really help you tackle the project in a more efficient manner. And again, if you can have a computer or a tablet, that one, you have the crew manual on, or just, you can go in and take a look at the collection or what other libraries have. It really helps you with your process as you're doing your weeding. And here's that weeding slip that I was mentioning. So as you can see, this weeding slip has the musty criteria, and has recommendations that you can make for the item. Again, depending on how your workflow is within your library, you can modify a slip like this and make it fit your workflow based on how your departments interact and how the decisions are made about actually pulling the trigger on a recommendation of a weeded item. But this really helps you do that. And again, you could utilize literally this weeding slip to help your staff tackle a weeding project, or you can modify it to suit your needs. There's going to be a video at the end of this session that Kim prepared. That's excellent. It's about 9 minutes long, and it'll go through the whole weeding process and how you utilize the weeding slip, which is something, again, I take advantage of every time I weed. So, when you're in the stacks and you're weeding, I mean, literally, you do actually want to handle each item. You want to look at them. You want to check the item for the date of publication. As I said earlier, the last circ, the number of circs. Condition is really critical. Again, an item that may even have value, you may look at it, but it's been, edited by a patron. There's writing in it. There's all sorts of highlighting in it. Maybe some pages have been removed, or it's just been repaired too many times and it's literally falling apart. And then you want to consider the format. Maybe this isn't the best format that the book should be in. Maybe it's better as an audio book, or maybe it should be in the reference collection, whether it's that book or something like it. And again, that's where you consider the key information, which might have changed recently. You always want to make sure accuracy is factored into what you keep in your collection. Even if you have this would be more of an academic library, but you think, well, it shows how people were thinking at a given time. But you know what? That's not really the role of a public library per se. It's more of an academic. So once something becomes inaccurate, I would highly recommend that you pull it out of the collection, because you don't want to be putting out misinformation there. We get enough of that from our media. So librarians should not be doing that. There's a reference here to standard catalogs, and these are something you can use. And of course, the State Union catalog, Find It, is a great place to take a look and see if things are in there. I wouldn't go crazy looking at all the other types of standard catalogs, just because it can be a little challenging to add that layer of work to it. But again, check and Find It is a good way to go, or even OCLC. You can check WorldCat as well. So, I mean, there's little things you can do. Just see, hey, do other folks have this? Do they still value this title? Or is it a decision I can make now where I can actually get rid of it? And again, finding out whether there are other items in the consortium. If you get rid of it, can you get it from somewhere else through either interlibrary loan or the Borrow It program? Or is it a library that's in your consortium and you guys have lending back and forth between the consortium? So lots of things to consider. You're not always going to consider every element of this. One element may actually be like, decision made. I'm kind of done. This book is completely in poor condition. I'm getting rid of it. But you have many options to consider as you're going through and evaluating each title. And then so the process, once you've, decided to remove an item from the collection, you want to make sure that your weeding slip is in there and it's marked with your decision. Again, so there's, as part of the workflow, if someone has a question about, hey, I don't know why we're removing that book. Well, it's on the slip. You can kind of see why we decided that. And then if you do end up saying, yes, we are definitely removing this from the catalog, you want to go in and delete it from the catalog. If you submit your holdings to OCLC, you want to update those records as well. So let OCLC know, hey, we don't have that title anymore, because you don't want people going to WorldCat and then thinking you have a title that you don't. The accuracy of the database, so to speak, is always important. I'll just say also, you always want to try to update your holdings and Find It. I would recommend at least, probably monthly or quarterly basis, because again, that is the database that we use for interlibrary loan, and also people rely on it if they're just looking for a book and find out what library, hey, does another library in the state have this title? I'm going to go to Find It and see where I can maybe take a ride and pick it up. But The other thing you want to do is when you remove an item and it might be out there in the world still floating around, you don't want people to think it actually belongs to your library anymore. So make sure you stamp it, either withdrawn or discarded, and make sure you remove all the markings as best you can, especially if you're going to recycle these items and you want to have a policy. So when you do dispose of it or recycle it, whatever you do, you want to have a policy. Maybe it's, first we try to do this, second we try to do this, third we try to do this, and then worst case scenario, we actually have to basically, throw it away. So not the ideal situation, but there are books at some point that just don't have any value and no one else is going to want it. And you definitely don't want to send those out to other people either. So this is something that Kim mentioned and something that we used to do as well at a previous library is when we had, hard decisions to make about a title where maybe we had a personal affiliation with the title and affection for it. Do a last chance display and put it in a place maybe right by where people are checking their books out at the circ desk or by the elevator or anywhere where they might see it quite easily. And this last chance display will be one of those decision makers that, hey, it sat there for another couple months, still nobody checked it out. We can definitely weed it. Or maybe they do check it out and you can see that they're still interested in it, and then you can put it in your collection. And then hopefully by then you've weeded the collection where it used to be, and discoverability and appearance and everything is better too. Because sometimes that's why things don't circulate, is because people just can't find them because the stacks are not in the state that they really should be in. So use that last chance display. Rare books. So Kim kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. Um, I'm going to say one thing about this from a personal experience is one, trying to kind of find out if a book is valuable, or even a collection of books is valuable, can be really time consuming and challenging. So you want to do sort of a cost benefit of if the staff time that has to be dedicated to this, is it worth the money that we'll get back for this old book? And even sometimes just the way your municipality works and taking in dollars for rare books. There may be challenges associated with that. So it may be a lot of work. So just factor that in. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It just means you should consider, is it giving me the cost benefit for the work that my staff is putting into this? Um, so, if a book is old, that doesn't necessarily mean it's valuable. And the other thing with library books is if I'm a collector and I go out and I want to get a copy of, some great novel from the 20s or 30s or whatever, I don't want a book that has a date due slip in it and a pocket in it and it's stamped and it's been used over and over again and it's so worn. So library books aren't always what collectors are looking for. The times that they might be looking for it is if it just isn't available anywhere else. So just keep that in mind as well. And then there are online booksellers that can allow you the ability to sort of do a quick evaluation of a title and see if it's something that you might want to keep. The tool that I used typically was Bookfinder, so that's the one that worked for me. But there are 3 links here that you can take advantage of. There are other online booksellers that do provide that kind of pricing information. But from my personal experience, I found Bookfinder was the best. So disposal, when you're going, again, this is something that should sort of be in your policy, that you can refer to if you're ever challenged about your process. Have a policy that says, the first option we're going to do is we're going to try to sell the book. The friends are going to have a library book sale if you have a friends group. I will say that I did a book sale. We had no friends group at the library I was at, so we did a book sale. It was a lot of work. So again, you have to factor that in terms of we basically all volunteered our time. We went to one of our branches on a weekend, had an outdoor event, but it was an extremely labor intensive process. And I would say I didn't feel for us that we got the bang for the buck when we were looking for the number of items that we sell. So then we had to box everything up and kind of figure out what do we do with it next. So that's why if you do have a friends group and they can do the heavy lifting for you, that's probably a better option. But it's again, we did find new homes for some of those books, and that always makes me feel good. So you just again have to consider how much staff time it takes and make sure that you're getting value for the efforts that you make for a book sale if you do something like that. There are online options for selling books as well as in person. Again, you can have a cart. Um, Gets a little confusing sometimes when you have books that still look like library books and you're giving some away, by the circ desk and maybe security wise, they're like, is this a library book or is it not? So make sure your markings are up to date. But there is that option of having kind of a free cart by the circ desk or even outside beyond where the circulation desk is as people come in the library. But you can definitely make a few bucks that way. And then those books do find a new home, which is really helpful. You can give it away as well. You can find assisted living facilities. You can work with prisons, although there's administrative challenges that you have to navigate to do things like that. You can send them out internationally, and like I said, you can do the free cart. The thing about giving things away, especially to the assisted living facilities, the prisons, and if you do send them out to other countries where you think there might be a need, make sure you're not giving them things that you would have thrown out otherwise. You want to make sure there's still some value and quality that you're not sending out misinformation and junk. So definitely factor that into your decision making process if you're going to give it away. And then recycling. So often there are recyclers in your area at your transfer station in your town. There may be a recycling option, but there's also, and I've seen this done at many libraries, um, programs the library actually will present where they utilize old books for basically the materials you use to create art. So that's kind of fun and really interesting, and it's a great use of a book that really has no intrinsic value as something you want to read anymore. And then finally, and I said this earlier, if you do have to basically say this book no longer is something I want to put in someone else's hands, and we have to get rid of it, make sure your ownership isn't obvious, and then put it in the black bag, and if you can't recycle it, throw it away. So it's not something you necessarily want to do. It's the last choice, but it needs to be kind of part of your disposal process. All right, so there are lots of resources here. As Kim said, these links should all be good, so we've checked them. There are definitely we mentioned the online sales, that is an option. There are resellers like Better World Books and Discover Books. You can find places to give away with the links listed under that bullet. So there are lots of options that are available. One thing I want to point out is that Kim and I thought it was Christmas. We thought we were given the greatest gift in the world because Baker and Taylor contacted us about a program called Sustainable Shelves. And we were ecstatic because not only were they going to take books that they wanted and resell them, repurpose them, make sure that they had a new life, they were going to take the books that nobody really wanted anymore and they were going to recycle them for us. So they did that for, I forget how long it was, Kim, but probably about a year or so. We were really sending a lot of books. So we took advantage of this more than probably almost any other library in the country, I bet. We were just sending them everything we could find. And so what they would do is they would send you a list, and there would be titles that were green, and those were the ones that they would resell, and then titles that were pink, and then you box them accordingly, send them to Baker and Taylor, and they took care of everything else. So we were so happy about this. I think it turned out to be something that wasn't sustainable for them. It was too probably expensive, too challenging, and maybe too many people took advantage of it like we did, and they just couldn't handle the flow. So they're kind of like Better World Books now. They just take your green titles that they can resell. So it is a recycle no more option. So just, it was something that was great. I appreciate that they did it, but that's no longer available. So just keep that in mind. Again, recycling, we've talked about that. And, there are some other ideas under that bullet where you can come up with different ways that you might sort of take care of using something in a positive way. So check these resources out at your leisure. Like I said, all these links are hot, so you can check them out.
Okay. And what I can say is we're noticing that Better World Books and Sustainable Shelves take different titles. So just between those two, you can get rid of a lot. But man, that was the best day in the world when we realized that they would take everything. And then like equally sad. But you do what we can. And as we find new resources, we will continue to update our LibGuides. Our LibGuides at the State Library are always live and active, because we know that disposal method is one that really kind of gets people. So special collections, let's talk about that. Children's fiction. At the end of the day, right, like children YA fiction, it's all relatively similar, but there are definitely still some things to consider with regards to what you read. The first one, is this book still popular? Are kids reading like Thomas the Tank Engine the way that they were reading it when I was little? I don't know, right? But those are the types of things that you want to consider. Is Paw Patrol still as popular as it used to be? If the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, right, then that's something that you want to take into consideration. Particularly in children's fiction, because children are not adults, right? Children, depending on the child, but let's just sort of speak from a holistic developmental sort of perspective, are more likely to believe what they see. My sister believed that, what was it, that your small intestines could stretch around the entire planet. Someone told her that, and she believed it with her whole heart. And it was a very long conversation to explain that, no, that's not true. But from a developmental perspective, kids are going to believe what it is that they see. So, if you've got books that sort of have negative or misleading representation, right? People with disabilities, people of different genders, people of different races. We hope that adults are going to come from those titles from a mindset and a developmental stage of understanding the difference between like fact and opinion, and everyone's opinion is different and people sort of believe in different facts, and that's kind of neither here nor there. But what we know is that children and their brains and their mindsets are not in the same spaces that adults are. So it becomes extra important that what we are putting forth, not just in nonfiction, right, where fact is fact, but with fiction, right, you don't kind of live by that statement of fact is fact. There's a bit more nuance. So just take care, kind of with some of the titles that are brought in, and with a lot of this sort of stuff under stereotyping, additional professional development is just going to have to happen, right? There's not enough time today to kind of go into the nuances of all of this, but that's why one thing that we try to stress is that it's not about librarianship is not piecemeal, right? It's not something where you can take like where, reference people focus on this and children's folks focus on that and circulation folks focus on that. Everyone needs to know a little bit about everything because so much of the work is intertwined. So it's not just, admin and, I don't know, circulation that needs to do some of this training on customer service and, sort of the understanding of different peoples and their experiences because maybe they sit at a circulation desk or whatever. It's really everybody, even if you sit in the back in an admin office and order titles. It's really important that everybody understand a little bit about a lot of aspects of librarianships. It is not piecemeal. So when you see professional development opportunities, even if you don't think they're for you, I promise they are. I promise. In some way, shape, or form. You might have to do a little bit of growth mindset and a little bit of thinking outside of the box. Perhaps the person giving the presentation won't say, John Doe, this is why this is important to you, because we're presenting to 30 people at a time. But so much of librarianship is intertwined. So there's that, right? And then in children's, we have a lot of award winners, and the concept of classics can cause real wild conversations on the listservs, right? So is it important that a children's fiction collection have every nutmeg ever in the existence of nutmeg? I'm not going to answer that because I don't want to get angry emails. Is it important, right, that the children's fiction collection have every is it Newberry children or teen? Newberry's children, Princess Teen, have every Newberry title that has ever won a Newbery in the entire history of the Newbery. Do you think that your library needs to have a copy of those or two copies of those? Do what your gut tells you. Plot twist, I say absolutely not. Absolutely. If you call me and ask me, I'm going to say do not know. Especially when you pair some of that with some of these other things that we want to talk about, like stereotyping and blah, blah, blah. It just goes and goes. It's all intertwined. So you no, you might not need those, right? There comes a point where you just one of the things that we used to say when giving this presentation, we are a library, we are not Amazon. We're not going to have everything in the world, right? In 4 different formats. It's just not going to happen. It's not our place. It's not our job. No way. But then also sort of like I mentioned with the Karma Wilson book, picture books in particular get a lot of love. They get a lot of love. In some ways, having a book where the pages are falling out of the binding could be a badge of honor, right? That means you did a really great job selecting your collection and the world wants it. They want these books. They want to read them. They're reading them over and over and over again. Anyone who works in children's services has probably heard from a grown-up who says, little Timmy makes me read this book every night. Can we renew it? Something, something. Now all the pages are gone. Just buy another one, right? So just these are things, especially with like picture books, graphic novels, because there's such quick reads. It's very rare that someone comes and takes one 32-page picture book. They're typically going to take like 12, right? So just kind of the nature of that collection is going to get a different type of circ, and is going to require really close attention being paid to those bindings and glues and thread and all that jazz. Young adult fiction is a booming space. Within young adult fiction, you not only have sort of the designated young adult age group that's reading these titles, sometimes you're going to have slightly younger, like tweens, who are just reading at a different level, who are reading these titles. And then you've got adults who are reading these. I mean, like the young adult fiction is just like hot, and there's a new popular book every, I swear to God, like 4 minutes it feels like. It's a really unique literary space. It's really fascinating to watch, and I don't say that just because that's the field I really like working in. But so with regards to sort of weeding within that section, is the YA title over 5 years old? And in my opinion, I think, like I said before, 5 years is generous. We really might want to look at like 3 years. But 5 years can kind of sort of exist as a baseline. But then something also to be said, and we see this a lot in tween and teen titles. What's the cover looking like? What is the cover looking like? I think at this point we've all stopped lying to ourselves and saying don't judge a book by its cover. We're all going to judge that book by its cover. We're going to do it, and it's fine. But a title, a book that has kind of an older looking like 80s cover, even if the story is still relevant and like really well done, and I know that the teens would love it if I could just get them to read this book. If the cover's not it, they're not reading it. And that's why we've seen things like the Hardy Boys reprinted with modern covers, things like Nancy Drew reprinted with modern covers. Those were never really my thing, but that sort of adventure storyline is still or at the time was still very prevalent with that age demographic of readers. And it lent to sort of the Nancy Drews and the Hardy Boys, the fact that there was a long backlist. They did it with American Girls. They kind of just made a whole new spin-off with them, but sort of like the republication of these titles to sort of share these sort of older traditional stories with teens, but the publishing company, and I think we as librarians realize that if it looks boring, we're not school, we can't force them to read it, they're not taking it. Also sort of the concept of the fad. So we've seen that a ton, like I said, in young adult services, which is why it's 5 years, sure. But again, really, maybe we should be looking at 3, 4 years with some of these titles because some of them burn hot and fast. And when the fad is over, the fad is over. Does that mean that it won't circle back around in 7 years? Not necessarily, but quite frankly, just buy a new book because it probably has a new cover. It probably has the movie version of the cover, quite frankly. So those are the kinds of things that you're really going to have to hone in on in a way that you might not necessarily some of them adults, they love reading the classic book with the original cover. I'm not one of them, but I know those people exist. And then is there still a demand for the series? And sort of what that might mean is that maybe because of all of our resource sharing opportunities, maybe it's not necessary to have every book in an entire series. Maybe it's okay to have book 1 and 2 to kind of find your local reader, right? Sort of find this person who's interested in this because I'm old, all I can say is goosebumps. I don't know, sort of get them started with the series, but it's maybe not necessary, or maybe you don't have the space within your YA section to have all of the goosebumps, all of the boxcar children. Just let me live in the 90s, please. I hope you can translate that to something. Thank you, goosebumps, right? Maybe Babysitters Club, whatever. Maybe it's okay to have book 1, 2, or 3, and then use our resource sharing services to sort of feed the patrons the rest of the book in the series because it's only like a handful of people reading them, or you don't have the space for it, or whatever. So those are just some of the things because YA can sometimes burn hot and fast to keep in mind within that collection. And then again, like we talked about with picture books, those books can get tattered at like the speed of light. It's almost like if you breathe too hard near it, the pages are going to fall out sometimes. But that just means that they are well loved, and that's okay. We should all kind of pat ourselves on the back for selling rainbow fish to everyone who comes in the building. And so that's why also something to sort of consider, particularly for those of you who are department heads or who manage collection and have kind of an assigned budget to you for a collection. If at all possible, set aside a portion of your budget for replacements, especially if you work in children's services, because you don't want to delete rainbow fish and never bring it back. What are you, a monster? No, you want to replace rainbow fish because you want to be able to feel a sense of pride when you give it to someone and not, I'm so sorry, every single page is taped and there might be some ice cream on page 13. No one wants to do that. That's weird. And again, kind of with this picture book section, there's going to be those fads. Is Thomas the Tank Engine still hot like that? I don't know. Are people still reading Peter Rabbit the way they used to? You should probably have some, but do you need a multitude, right? But just sort of remaining cognizant of sort of what's happening within the children's world through TV shows, new movies. Remember when Lightning McQueen first happened, right? Like it's just really important to sort of stay on top of that stuff to the best of your ability because it is going to directly affect your job and sort of what's happening with books. And sort of the children and YA nonfiction are really going to follow the same guidelines as the adult nonfiction. But again, I think at every opportune moment, I'm just going to kind of remind you, these kids will believe what they are told. I promise you, my sister really, really thought that she could stretch her intestines around the planet because that's how much intestine was in her stomach. It was kind of sweet. She was little. I think she was like 11 and she had been told that and just held on to it. And it took me and my parents to say, no, it's not. Let's just think about that for a minute. If you think about it, it doesn't hold up, but they're kids, right? They're impressionable. So it's just really, really important that they are going to accept what you tell them. They are going to accept that George Washington Carver invented peanut butter. He did not. He did not do it. So just please really, really try to stay on top of that. And don't let the fear of empty shelves put you in a position of sharing information that is not accurate or is not as it appears into the hands of these impressionable children. It is not worth it. Um, that's my soapbox. I feel so strongly about this.
All right, so much of what Kim just talked about is going to apply to fiction as well, but I'm going to go through it. And one thing I'll just say about if you say you weeded an area because everything was inaccurate for nonfiction, one thing you can do is if you don't have a book to put there, put a sign about a database that answers the same question. I mean, there's other ways of utilizing that space if you don't have enough titles in that particular subject area. So just another option you can take advantage of. So in terms of adult fiction, it always comes down to this. Is it circulating? If it's not, it's probably got to go. I mean, that's really one of your main criteria. So always factor that in. Duplicate copies are really great to have when something is hot, when it's a bestseller, or even if it's tied to a movie or a Netflix series or whatever it might be. You might want to have duplicate copies, but you don't want them forever. One, they take up a lot of space. Two, they're not going to circulate anymore. So when you remove your duplicates, take a look at all of them. What's the best copy, in terms of condition? Pick that one, keep that, get rid of the rest. Um, Always look at titles that you're considering reading. Are they part of a series? If they are, and it happens to be that volume one of the series was kind of a long time ago, and based on your reading criteria, you might want to get rid of it. If it's part of a series, you want to keep it. So you have to make a decision not about volume one. You have to make a decision about the whole series. And some series do actually fade away and they're no longer relevant. Sometimes the author is no longer writing, and that will impact. Obviously, there's going to be no more additions to the series, and it may mean that interest in that series has waned. Not always, but sometimes. So just something to consider. Is it up to date in style and setting? And we talked about this a little bit earlier. If there's something in your collection that doesn't speak to people anymore, to especially to the people in your community, if it's informed by racism or sexism, that shows how people were at that time related to racism and sexism, maybe you want to get rid of it. Maybe it's just not what you want to be presented to your community anymore. So you really want to, factor that in when you're looking at a particular title. And it's another, decision-making point that you can use to decide whether you want to keep it or let it go. Again, condition is critical. You want books that look nice, that smell nice, that aren't offensive to someone because they're in such bad condition. If it's something that you think you really need, replace it. And so you may want to work with your selectors and make sure that they sort of allocate a portion of their budget for replacements. Always think about that. I do it with my ebooks, and when I selected print books, I always kind of had that in mind. And again, it's a great way to keep the collection fresh and looking good. Now, not every genre, like I read fiction, but I don't read all types of fiction. So if a genre is not familiar to you and you feel uncomfortable maybe making decisions about a particular genre, check with one of your colleagues. I bet you if you're in a library with any number of people, almost every genre in fiction is going to be covered, and people will give you a little bit of feedback about whether that genre is still relevant, and whether you need to keep it or expand upon it. And the other thing that's nice about working at a service point is you're going to have people coming in. They're going to ask for things that they're interested in. If nobody's asking about a particular genre anymore, you might be able to weed pretty deeply into that section of your collection. So keep that in mind as well. And then, as always, we've kind of hit this point at almost every slide that we've had in our presentation today. Is it available elsewhere? If it is available elsewhere, you're making probably a good decision. If it's not circulating in your library, hey, I can pull it off. But if they need to get it, hey, I'll refer them to interlibrary loan and they can get the title that way. All right, next slide. All right. So we have this slide in here with a hot link. There's a great article by Rebecca Banook. I highly recommend you take a look at it. It's just, it's one of those things that sometimes it's not terribly long. It's not terribly challenging. It's just so helpful sometimes to have someone put their ideas down in an article, and you can quickly read it and assimilate that. So I highly recommend you take a look at this. We have her book about weeding in our print collection, and we also have it in our ebook collection as part of EcoCT. So if you go into Palace, you can find her work there as well. So highly recommend you take a look at that. So, graphic novels and manga, not necessarily my area of expertise. So, if I'm going to weed this collection, I'm going to reach out to someone in the library staff, or maybe even someone who's not on library staff but is really interested in graphic novels and manga, and see what they think about things. So, a lot of what we do for fiction, we should factor into our graphic novel collection. Condition obviously is always very important, and as Kim mentioned earlier, a lot of times these are not put together in a way that is meant for library use. They're paper, they're paperback. They're not bound well. They might just be stapled together and the pages come out. So they're not necessarily going to last a long time. So, if there are pages missing, the condition is, it appears all wrinkled and the pages are bent. That condition is something you're going to have to say, you know what, I might want to get rid of it. Again, duplicates, the same thing applies here. If it's not circulating at a high rate, you don't need multiple copies of it. Low circ is always a factor. One thing I will say that I noticed at my previous library is a lot of times graphic novels and manga didn't always get checked out. So you may want to factor that into your in-house use. If you can track that a little bit, you might see that something's not getting checked out, so there are no search stats on it, but people that are coming in the library like taking a look at it. So if you can, try to factor that in. That's very helpful. The other thing is a lot of these graphic novels are, one of a series of, say, 10 or whatever it may be. So you may wind up getting gaps in your series, which is really frustrating to someone they're on 3, they can't wait to go to 4, and you know what? We don't have it. It's either fell apart or the publisher, we couldn't buy another copy when we lost it. So there's things that you want to factor in when you can't have the complete series. I don't know if it's worth keeping a portion of the series. But in a previous iteration of this presentation, one recommendation, and I thought this was brilliant, was take a look at other libraries in the state. Maybe someone has, 1, 3, and 5, and you have 2 and 4. Maybe one of you take the others part of the collection and put it into one. And then if you need to get it, you can get it through interlibrary loan. So, that type of collaboration and resource sharing can be really helpful. And then, of course, when you look at a series for many different reasons, sometimes a set is uncompletable. Again, because, they're old and they're not published anymore, or, these publishers are not maybe as solid and consistent as like the big 5 that are always going to be there. So sometimes you can't even find the publisher to purchase these items again. So some sets may actually be uncompletable. So different challenges. A lot of, like I said, what Kim said before applies here, but just a couple different nuances for graphic novels and manga.
Yes, thank you, Brad. And I just quickly wanted to jump in. We got a question that kind of, I think, has to do with a lot of this from Pat from Rathburn Library. A lot of libraries no longer stamp the due dates in the book. So when it comes to see the last date checked out, is the info to help decide the weeding run through reports? Yes, it is. So a lot of times, depending on your system, right? Everyone's different. Some folks are using Millennium. Some folks are using Evergreen. At the state library, we use Alma/Primo, depends on which end you're looking at. And I actually run a lot of those reports for, I'm looking this way. I actually run a lot of those reports for us. And every system is going to be a bit different, and it might be worth seeing if we can organize something where someone from each system can kind of talk about some of this. But you should be able to run the report and select the items that you want put into the report that typically populates into an Excel spreadsheet. So when I run the reports for weeding or for inventory, I can go in and self-select from the back end that I want author, I want title. I make sure to add publication date and creation date. So not only the day that the item was published, but when did we get it, which might have been like a year later, which could sort of affect some of that circulation information. in-house circs and out-house circs, like Brad just mentioned. With a lot of these graphic novels, kids in particular are just grabbing the books and probably even sitting like on the floor, like under a table or something, reading through these. You can typically run a report to populate that checkout material, because you are correct. Typically, it's different for everyone, but typically we are not stamping due dates into books anymore. So it's your computer system that I I don't want to say yes for sure, because then there'll be some random system and I'm wrong, but I have not yet been to a library or worked in a library, and I've worked under 3 or 4 different systems, some in consortium, some not, where you weren't able to get that information. So thank you for asking that question, Pat. And if you run into some problems, reach out and maybe we can at least put you together with someone who can kind of help you figure out how to run some of that in your specific operating system. And I just quickly wanted to touch base with the question that was asked by Sarah. That is a great question. Just so you know, Brad, I know you're working on a laptop. Sarah mentioned that children's nonfiction in the 200s. Which is typically where a lot of religious texts are. They have trouble feeling like we're weeding this section with appropriate background knowledge on all of the world's religions. Any tips would be helpful. Whoops. Wait, I don't even know. No, I was in the right spot. Sorry, y'all. So the first thing that I want to say, I know I've mentioned this a couple times, and I recently just dropped into the chat about our Reader's Advisory Workshop series. It's being done by Becky Spratford. For anyone who doesn't know her by name, she runs a blog called RA for All, Reader's Advisory for All, and this is exactly the kind of stuff that she talks about. How do you make informed decisions with regard to your collection when you can't know all things about all things all the time? And she's got amazing tools to help do that. In particular, I'm making a note of this. I don't know that I have an answer right now, but my answer to a question like this is very similar, I think, to my answer about other sort of similar topics, even if it's not specific to a section of nonfiction. Becky Spratford. And I put a link to, we're doing a 4-part workshop series. If you scroll up a little bit, it's going to take you to the LibGuides page that Gail made. I believe slides and recordings will be shared, but she's absolutely amazing. Look at this. Yeah, share information. A CLA meeting last week for Children's Services. We learned about other library reclassifying their 200s. It's very interesting. We may follow suit. It may help with the weeding process. Thank you, Ryan. And I'm going to look at that myself, Ryan. So thank you very much for sharing. But I think this is when it comes to us finding the resources where we can hear from the professionals. So when it comes, a section that I'm really trying to focus on at the Service Center are Indigenous nonfiction titles. Who wrote them? Is the material accurate? And the answer is I don't know. Offhand, I don't. So that's when I'm going to have to find some resources by reputable people from Indigenous communities, perhaps reach out to the American Indian Studies Museum and sort of reach out and get some help. There are absolutely going to be sections of a library collection where it just, we say it a lot, but it just really wasn't covered in library school. And because of the context, especially when we're talking about nonfiction collections, it is vitally important that we take every step possible to make sure that we're presenting the best information that we can. Also knowing we might mess up. We might mess up. And if we do, we fix it. But I think what's most important is that we go into the work that we're doing, knowing that we're giving it our all. So I've made a note as a result of this to begin to, in my space as a consultant, to do some research and find some of those experts who are doing the work to help those who work in libraries or those who build collections to sort of help steer and guide us, like Becky Spratford, like Debbie Reese, right? You know, who sort of does that work. So thank you for bringing this up. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing resources. Thank you, Rebecca, for sharing Becky Spratford's name again. And let's power through. Sorry to jump in there, Brad, but those are some really great questions.
No, that was great. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about reference. So As I mentioned earlier, think about, is the information available online or in Research at CT or in some of your own databases? Research at CT basically covers every subject area. The question about religion is we don't have a religion database, but academic search premier or primary search in one of these databases will have great information about all the world's religions. So you could definitely put a little flyer up and say, hey, want to learn more about world religions? Go to research it. So that is an option, and you're going to get up-to-date information there, which is really good. When you talk about newer editions in a print collection, sometimes they're slow in coming out. Sometimes by the time they come out and actually get on your shelf, they're not really that new anymore. That's the nice thing about Research It or other databases that you might subscribe to, is updating them is much easier and it's much more timely. So take advantage of those online resources for your reference collection. I kind of mentioned this when we talked about our graphic novels and manga, but observations of patron use is really important. So, a lot of times people come in, they use items, references not circulating. So you want to kind of take a look at what they're using and maybe make a note of it, whether it's anecdotal or share with the selectors, that you're seeing something get used a lot from the reference collection. Because otherwise, other than it maybe by where, you can't tell that something's being used. So if you can do a little bit of an in-house count, I do recommend that. And of course, as we say with all the different areas we talk about, the crew manual has guidance, for the specific subject areas and types of materials. So that is something you jump to anytime you have a question that you don't feel was answered in another area. Go to your crew manual and take a peek at it. It'll be super helpful. So AV is another area that, this is an area that is changing rapidly because of all the streaming services and the fact that ebooks and e-audiobooks are so prevalent. So you have to look at the format. Is the format still something that's being utilized? And that's not to say that VHS isn't used by anyone. Your particular community may still have people that use VHS. And so if that's the case, you may want to keep some around. But a lot of times, the formats are not being utilized anymore. So if they aren't, you can kind of look at everything in that format might be able to be removed. For us, our audiobooks on CD. So that's a collection that we were adding to until recently, but we've decided to stop adding new titles and we're going to put those dollars into other materials. So that collection will slowly sort of fade away by attrition and by some weeding. And at some point, probably in the next year or so, we probably won't have those anymore because we think that format, for a number of reasons, is not as viable as it once was. Look in your car. Do you have a CD player? Not everyone has a CD player anymore. So those books aren't going to be of value to you anymore. So you want to look at, I'm going to download the Palace app and I'm going to get my audiobooks for my commute that way. The formats are going to change. So just be cognizant of that as you're looking about weeding and maybe eliminating collections. As with books, any AV materials that are not in good condition, and it may be even more important in some cases here, you want to get rid of them. If the CDs don't play anymore, if the DVD doesn't play anymore because it's scratched or cracked or whatever the case may be, you want to get rid of it. And you want to make sure it's in a container that still looks decent, that it's not completely ruined. Those do get heavy use. They don't always travel well, so they can really be looking pretty shabby after a while. And then circulation here, really, you want to make sure something is circulated probably within the last year. If it hasn't, that should be a high on your list in terms of your decision-making process about whether you should keep it or not. And sometimes, believe it or not, and seems very time-consuming, but you may actually have to view or listen to it. One, to see if it's still functional, and two, to be able to kind of look or listen to what's being said or what's being portrayed, and make sure that you still want to keep it. And then, of course, resource sharing is key. If it's available via ILL, you might be able to pull it off your shelf without any worries. But the key factors that you want to consider when you're looking at AV materials is it popular, is it circulating, and is it in good condition? So that's kind of the highlights for AV. And like I said, Crew Manual provides information about all of these different formats and genres, etc. So definitely take a look at that and take advantage of that resource. So we have,
Um,
is this you, Kim?
yep, this is me, and this is kind of the end, folks. Like this is we're wrapping up. I'm not even going to read through all of these. These are all links for recommended resources that center around reading and collection management. They are all live, including things like OCLC, a really funny sort of like a website with articles at a link call or a website called Awful Books. Thank you, Linda Williams. Some resources that are school specific, as well as some online courses. Web Junction, I'm a big fan of. For people who still don't realize, the Connecticut State Library has purchased access to Niche Academy for every library worker in the state of Connecticut, and it has more recordings and presentations than I can even count, and I go in there all the time. Further readings of books from the Middletown Library Service Center that you all know can be checked out and sent to you by Deliver It. A cute little sort of library life cycle, which is why we're saying a lot of collection management, because everything goes from acquisitions to reading. And then the final thing that we're going to show you all before we close up, we might go a little bit over. So if folks are able to or would like to sort of hang in and ask a question or two, you're welcome to do that. But the way that this, whoops, sorry, I was listening to myself talk. We used to run these sort of like in person, and we would send folks into the stacks to do work, and what we have done to sort of demonstrate the actual weeding process and weeding slips is I made a video way back in 2020, and just to kind of demonstrate the process. So let me do a new share. I'm also going to sneeze, excuse me. Let's change. Okay, I'm screen sharing the right thing. Let's share that sound, and there we go.
Hi everyone, this is Kim, your children and young adult library consultant, and I'm here to record a short video on examples of books that you might want to read from your collection and how to use the weeding slips. So I'm going to turn my camera around here. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you are the weeding slips. This is the back, and this is the front. So you'll see on this weeding slip the acronym that we probably talked about in the webinar already, MUSTY. So this gives you kind of the outline of what you're looking for in a book that would require you to weed it, or that would put it up for weeding consideration. So we've got M for misleading, U for ugly, S superseded, T trivial, I irrelevant, and E elsewhere. So the first book that I would like to show you is this one, Inventions. So we can already look at the cover of this book and see that it's possible that it's a book that's a little older. The cover probably isn't going to be as interesting to the kids or teens that may come into our library looking for it. Let's open this book and check the publication date. So we'll see that this book was published in 2003, so well over 10 years ago. So let us come over here and take a look at our reading slip. So at first glance, I would categorize this as M, misleading, outdated or obsolete, and possibly also S, superseded. I am almost positive that there is a newer edition of, if not this exact book, Inventions, than a book that is fairly similar to it. So we would cross off M. Outdated or obsolete. and possibly even S superseded if you have an additional copy of this book or something that's really comparable. And then we're going to take it to the back and we decide, is this a book that we want to repair, or is this a book that we want to replace? So there's nothing really structurally wrong with it. The spine is okay. None of the pages are ripped or watermarked. So this is just something that we would just want to go ahead and replace. So then you decide here with something else on this subject with the newer edition of the same book. So maybe with something else on this subject, and then you could write some notes in here if you wanted to. One of the things that makes this particular reading slip incredibly helpful is that there's this little key on the back here with publication dates, so that you can kind of compare what the call number of the book is if it's nonfiction, and then you can kind of decide, is it 3 years old, is it 10 years old, and so on and so forth. And we've already decided this book is over 10 years old. It's time. So what you would do if you were reading a giant section is you would pop this slip here in the book, and then you would pop it on a book cart. So that way, when you finally do get around to pulling these books from the system, you'll remember why it was you chose to read this particular book. So let's take.
So because of time, I'm actually going to go ahead and stop the video here. Later on in the video, it's like the Cultures of the World series, and we have an older edition and a newer edition. So we get rid of the older edition. And then I think it's some books on like Egypt, which, you know, most libraries have 1.5 million copies of. And we decide that there's a newer version that we have that can sort of replace the older copy. So I am, just again, because I want to be respectful of people's time, that is the end of our presentation. That video is hyperlinked in these slides, which are already up on the LibGuides. Before folks skedaddle, I'm also going to drop in the direct link to our LibWizard survey. At the very top of the list, you're going to see Weeding in the Garden of Good and Evil. I put it at the top so no one has to scroll for it. And just because, you know, there was a little bit of conversation that was beginning to happen, I want to turn it over to if there are any questions that folks had in the last minute that will officially be here, but we can hang out for another extra few minutes if there's something anyone has a question about that we didn't touch base on. And I also just sort of want to call to Sarah, who puts a little slip of paper inside of the books on CD so that the patrons can sort of note as they're listening to the audiobook or anything, if anything is scratched, if there were any playback issues, so that when it's returned, the folks who are checking it in are notified kind of immediately, and can then decide what to do with this title if you know the scratch can't be cleaned. I think that's a great use of time, and maybe better than just like giving your teen volunteers a stack of audiobooks saying listen and tell me if something's gone wrong. So thank you for sharing that, Sarah. Let's see if there's any questions. And please fill out our survey. I really do read it, and then we'll immediately go in. I've already sort of jotted down a couple of additions to make for this presentation the next time. So please don't be shy, share your thoughts. We really do use them to inform our decision-making with future presentations and additional presentations that might tie into collections, but might not be for this one in particular. Have you ever run into issues where staff disagree about weeding methods/decisions, and how do you address these concerns? It's definitely happened. It's happened at the service center with, you know, one time someone asked for this, or the Babysitters Club is about to be a series. Are you sure we don't want to get rid of the old books from the 80s? I know it's happened with us, and sort of, I think, and you can speak to this too, Brad. Yeah. There's typically a person within the department who has the last say on books that are weeded. So at the service center, that's me. And I think a person within that type of leadership position is probably going to like listen, very closely to sort of any thoughts or suggestions by their fellow colleagues, especially if it's on a title that the colleague has more expertise on than the person who has sort of been named the final decision maker for whatever reason. Maybe they're the department head. But typically after conversation, sometimes it's just got to go. Maybe, and sometimes the reason that it's got to go is because, yes, one time someone did check out this book 3 years ago, which is less than 5 years, but I know we can get it from A, B, C, and D. So we're just going to go ahead and delete it. But typically there's one person who has the final decision. And I think Brad and I hope that that person is receptive to conversation, but I think it's really a matter of looking at those resources that we've talked about for resource sharing. What do you think, Brett?
Yeah, and I just, from my experience, I used to find that sometimes I'd be reading books and somehow they would go off my cart and be put back in the collection without me even having the chance to have a discussion because someone probably didn't really fully understand the weeding process, why we do it. So that's why having a good, sort of communication with staff about why you weed and what the goals are, that it's readily available. And if you do actually have the opportunity to talk to someone, have a good policy in place so you can point to that policy. That's what will help you with those types of situations. There was a time when I thought every book should be kept forever and should never be weeded. It took some education for me to understand why we have to keep our collections neat. So there may be someone on your staff that feels that way because they just haven't had the experience yet. So communicate it to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And those policies, I think at DLD, we probably say the word policy like every other day in our presentations, but there's a reason for it. And so then we have another question. Do you have any recommendations for starting weeding in sections that have been neglected for a few years, perhaps because of staff turnover or whatever reason? And my suggestion for that is sometimes there is a plan that someone has for a department that ties into weeding. So that's a really weird way to say that. But the library that I worked at before this one, I came in as a department head, and one of the things that I wanted to do was our circulation in the young adult nonfiction was a lot lower than I thought it should be. And some of that had to do with the placement of the collection. And again, some of it had to do with that discoverability, what titles were in there, what the covers looked like, and all of that. So we made the decision to move the titles in that section. And as we've mentioned, if you're moving things, if you're renovating things, even if it's a small move, like moving books from like the back shelf to the side shelf next to a circulation desk, that counts, right? So we went through and we did a really good weed, made a list of items to reorder while weeding to sort of replace and update some of the collections or to fill some of those gaps that were noticed during the weed. And circulation for that section tripled. It was a small move, but so the sort of where we started with regards to weeding collections sort of tied into a larger goal. So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's just picking a section that might be the least intimidating to weed, just to kind of get you into a groove and feeling comfortable, especially if you're creating new procedures, either based off of this presentation or just sort of other resources. That's going to be different for everybody. For me, picture books is the hardest to weed. Picture books was at the bottom. So I was like, how do I decide? How do I decide what goes? They're picture books. They're beautiful. So for me, it was actually easier to start in biographies, because typically there might be some people like, I mean, how many books on the Wright brothers do we actually need? And maybe we want to keep those books that have been published within the last 10 years and delete the like 3 or 4 that are 14 or 15 years old. So those are my 2 suggestions. If there's a bigger plan that ties into weeding, do that and maybe start from a section that's less intimidating. What do you think, Brad?
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of like if there is, no one there to weed a particular area, maybe you go put all your collection development folks together as a team and have everybody, because to stop weeding an area is really problematic and it really affects your whole collection. So I would definitely, try to have the team that does the weeding and the collection development continue to weed that area. I know staff time is at a premium, so that can be really difficult to do, but definitely, one way to do it is just look at it as something that needs to be continuous, and try to kind of plug people in as best you can to keep those areas up to date. And then I'll just mention something about the collections in transition. If you are going to eliminate a format, maybe it is by attrition. I would recommend that you look at the highest circulating items in that collection and then buy them in the new format, whether that's through a streaming service or one of your video streaming for movies, ebooks, e-audiobooks. Look at those as options to kind of fill that gap that you're creating, and then be able to make sure that staff can tell people, yes, we're definitely looking at maybe eliminating this collection over time, but if you go here, you can still access that title. So it's always a little bit painful.
Yeah. And to that end, Brad, Meg, I think something to also do at the same time is make sure that every single staff member knows how to use that new platform. I don't know how many people were working in public libraries when at the time it was Overdrive came into existence, where it just didn't exist and then it did. And there were some staff members that just had no interest in learning how to use the sort of Overdrive. And even though there were going to be people who were going to be e-readers and e-audiobook listeners, and I was the millennial, right? Like the person who was like, like I want to learn all of the new stuff. And then they were sending, older patrons, they were sending people up to the one person in the building who knew how to use the platform, which is until people like felt ready to learn. And that's just a lot of like work and effort on the one or two or even three people that know how to use that platform. And like what happens when they go on vacation, or like if they leave libraries for some reason. So I think at the same time, while you're sort of taking Brad's suggestion into consideration of perhaps beginning to purchase those high circ items, let's say in an e-audiobook format, or e-audiobook, because we're talking about books on CD at the moment. I think it's also really helpful so that when there is someone at circ, say, if someone's like, hey, where did all your Jan Ivanovich go? Like, woman's still writing. I got to know how this series ends, right? That person at Circ can say like, oh, we're actually switching things over to, this platform for X, Y, and Z reasons. If you've got a minute, I can show you how to get it right now. So I think it's really helpful when those two things go hand in hand. And we all got to know to some extent. Everyone's got to know something. It can't just be like a small handful of people who may or may not be there. I like what Maria said. At my previous library, every librarian was assigned a section for the collections, for acquisitions, weeding, etc. They had a schedule. I also created a collection maintenance schedule, which is broken down by like month, and then each tab has like 5 years. And it's something that I actively use at the service center. It actually breaks up the monotony of being in like nonfiction for your whole life. So for the month of February, per se, I might have on my weeding schedule that I'm going to go through the picture books, author's last name from A to C. I'm going to go through the maybe the 398s, just the 398s, right? And maybe biographies, G and H, right? Like, so just sort of breaking things up like that can also help with the monotony, but also it keeps you from feeling like you have to go through the entire collection at one time. So I love the idea of a schedule, and I think it really helps. And so I see that we've got folks who are skedaddling to lunch and other meetings. So thank you all so much for being here. We hope you've all learned something new. If this was a new presentation, welcome. Brad and I are here to answer any questions. If it was a refresher, I hope it was refreshing.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Wait. Where's the record button? I lost it.